careful distance its ribs showed through its thin coat and one ear flopped over. While the other stood straight up, I said, "Go home." James called out again this time. More firmly, the puppy stopped for a moment, then continued its determined pursuit. After half a block, James stopped walking and turned around completely. The puppy froze mid-step, watching him with wide eyes. There was something in those eyes, not just hunger or fear, but what seemed like desperation. "Listen, buddy, I can't help you. I'm not even supposed to have pets in my building." His voice softened. Despite himself, the puppy sat down right there on the sidewalk, its tail making tiny sweeps across the concrete. James ran a hand over his face and sighed. Something about the way the dog looked at him tugged at his heart. He knelt down slowly, extending his hand. The puppy flinched but held its ground, trembling slightly. "It's okay," James said softly, "I won't hurt you." As he moved closer, he noticed something around the puppy's neck, a worn leather collar barely hanging on tucked. Inside was what looked like a piece of paper folded and crumpled. James carefully reached for it, speaking in soothing tones as the puppy watched him with those intent eyes. His fingers fumbled with the paper in the dim light. When he finally unfolded it, his breath caught in his throat. Written in shaky, childish handwriting were the words, "Help, my brother is sick, no food, no water. Apartment 3B." James' exhaustion vanished instantly. His heart began to pound as the urgency of the situation hit him. He looked at the puppy, who was now standing, tail wagging hopefully. Without another moment's hesitation, James broke into a run. The puppy bounded alongside him, leading the way with newfound energy. Their footsteps echoed through the empty street as they raced against time, guided by the desperate message, and a brave little dog who refused to give up the apartment complex loomed before James like a shadow from another era. Paint peeled from its walls in long, jagged strips, and several windows were patched with cardboard instead of glass. Past the puppy led him through the entrance, where a broken security door hung limply on its hinges. Inside, fluorescent lights buzzed and flickered overhead, casting a sickly glow on the grimy hallway. The wallpaper, once probably cheerful with its floral pattern, now curled away from the walls in defeated strips. A musty smell hung in the air, mixed with something else James couldn't quite identify. His footsteps echoed on the cracked linoleum as he climbed to the third floor. Each step made his stomach tighten further, his police instincts on high alert. The puppy's nails clicked against the floor as it trotted ahead, stopping at a door marked 3B in tarnished brass numbers. James knocked firmly. The sound seemed to disappear into the heavy silence of the building. He waited, listening intently for any movement inside. "Nothing, police," he called out, pounding harder this time. The door rattled in its frame, but still no response came from within. Beside him, the puppy began to whine, pawing anxiously at the threshold. James tried the handle, finding it locked. The silence from within the apartment felt wrong, too complete, too heavy. Every instinct from his years on the force screamed that something was terribly wrong. He could feel his heart pounding against his ribs as he stepped back, evaluating his options. The puppy's whining grew more insistent. James made his decision, taking a deep breath. He positioned himself and kicked hard next to the lock. The door burst inward with a sharp crack. The smell hit him first, a thick, oppressive mixture of unwashed bodies, spoiled food, and neglect that made him gag as his eyes adjusted to the darkness. The beam from the hallway light cut through the gloom like a spotlight. There, in the corner of what must have been the living room, he saw them. A small boy, no more than 8, sat pressed against the wall. His thin arms were wrapped protectively around a bundle. A baby, James realized with a jolt. The older boy's eyes were huge in his gaunt face, reflecting the light like a frightened animal's. His lips were cracked and bleeding, his clothes hanging loose on his frame. The baby in his arms was unnaturally still, save for the rapid rise and fall of its chest. Even from where he stood, James could see the flush of fever on the infant's face. The older boy pulled his brother closer, pressing himself further into the corner, as if trying to disappear or to the wall itself. His whole body trembled, but he never took his eyes off James, watching him with a mixture of terror and desperate hope. James slowly approached the children, his movements deliberate and gentle. He knelt down a few feet away, not wanting to frighten them further. "Hey there," he said softly. "I'm Officer James. I'm here to help." The older boy's grip on his brother tightened, his knuckles white with effort. When James reached out a reassuring hand, the boy flinched so violently his head knocked against the wall. The puppy, sensing the tension, darted past James and went straight to the boy, its tail wagging as it began licking his face. The unexpected show of affection from the dog seemed to break through the boy's fear. His rigid posture gradually relaxed, and the trembling in his limbs began to subside. Tears welled up in his eyes. Cutting clean tracks through the dirt on his cheeks, James pulled out his phone and dialed 911, keeping his voice calm and steady as he requested paramedics. While he waited, he conducted a quick survey of the apartment, his heart growing heavier with each discovery. The kitchen cabinets stood empty, their doors hanging open like hungry mouths. In the refrigerator, a single carton of expired milk sat on its side, long since curdled. A bare mattress lay in one corner, its springs visible through worn fabric. Nearby, a crib stood with soiled sheets, a few dirty bottles scattered around its base. As he moved through the space, something in the trash can caught his eye, a crumpled piece of paper. He smoothed it out, his stomach dropping as he read the hastily scrolled words, "We can't do this anymore, no money, no jobs. We'll find help and come back, just take care of your brother, be strong." James's jaw clenched as he gripped the letter, the paper crinkling in his fist. The words rang hollow. These weren't the actions of parents desperately seeking help. This was abandonment, pure and simple. They had left their children to fend for themselves, the older boy forced to become a parent when he should have been playing with toys and going to school. The sound of approaching sirens filled the air as the reality of the situation hit James like a physical blow. These boys had no one, no family, no support, no one to care for them or keep them safe. As the wailing grew louder, he made a silent promise to the two small figures huddled in the corner they wouldn't be alone anymore. The paramedics burst through the apartment door, their equipment rattling. As they rushed to assess the situation, the younger brother lay motionless in his sibling's arms, his tiny chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. One of the medics gently took the baby, laying him on a portable stretcher. Severe dehydration, the paramedic muttered to his colleague as he checked the infant's vital signs. Possible organ failure, we need to move fast. The older boy's eyes widened with fear as they took his brother. He scrambled to his feet, his small hand shooting out to grab James's sleeve, his fingers twisted into the fabric, holding on with desperate strength. "It's okay," James assured him, placing his hand over the boy's. "They're here to help your brother. We need to let them do their job." The boy wouldn't let go of James's sleeve even as they made their way down to the ambulance. His legs trembled with each step, and James could feel him struggling to stay upright. Without hesitation, James scooped him up, carrying him down the stairs while the puppy trotted faithfully beside them. In the ambulance, the paramedics worked quickly on the baby, attaching 4 lines and monitoring equipment. James sat on the bench with the older boy pressed against his side, their hands clasped together. The puppy settled in James's lap, its brown eyes fixed on the boy with unwavering attention. The silence in the ambulance was broken only by the beeping of medical equipment and the occasional commands between paramedics. The boy's grip on James's hand tightened with each passing minute until finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, he asked, "Is my brother going to die?" James squeezed his hand firmly. "Not on my watch, kid," he replied, his voice steady and determined. "These people are really good at their jobs. They're going to take good care of your brother." The boy nodded slightly, his eyes never leaving the small form of his brother on the stretcher. The puppy whined softly and stretched its neck to lick the boy's free hand, drawing a ghost of a smile from him. When they arrived at the hospital, everything moved in a blur of activity. The paramedics rushed the baby through the emergency room doors, rattling off medical terms to the waiting staff. The older boy tried to follow, but hospital personnel stopped him at the entrance to the treatment area. "No, no," he cried out, clinging to James even harder. "I need to stay with him. He needs me. The doctors need space to help your brother," James explained gently, kneeling down to the boy's level. "We'll wait right here, okay? I promise we won't leave." 2 women in business attire approached them, their badges identifying them as social workers. The older one pulled out a notepad while the younger one smiled kindly at the boy. "We need to ask you some questions," the older social worker began, her voice professional but gentle. The boy pressed himself against James's side, trembling slightly. The Puppy positioned itself between the boy and the social workers, its posture protective despite its small size. James looked at the social workers. Taking in their clipboards and concerned expressions, he felt the boy's fingers digging into his arm, saw the fear in his eyes at the prospect of being taken away. In that moment, a decision began to war in his mind. The harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital waiting room cast faint shadows across the worn vinyl chairs. Where James and the boy sat, the clock on the wall ticked away endless minutes, each second stretching like hours. The boy hadn't loosened his grip on James's sleeve since they arrived. His small fingers wound tightly in the fabric as if it were his only lifeline. James noticed how the boy's eyes darted in nervously. Whenever hospital staff walked past, the puppy lay at their feet, its tail thumping against the linoleum floor in an anxious rhythm, matching the tension in the air. Every now and then it would raise its head and nuzzle the boy's ankle, offering silent comfort. "Are you hungry?" James asked, softly, breaking the heavy silence. The boy shook his head, but his stomach growled loudly, betraying him. James reached into his pocket and pulled out a granola bar he'd forgotten about from his shift. "Here, you need to keep your strength up." The boy accepted it with trembling fingers, his other hand never leaving James's sleeve. He ate slowly, mechanically, as if he'd forgotten what food tasted like. Sarah Brooks, the social worker, sat across from them, occasionally glancing up from her paperwork. James could feel the weight of her press, knowing that soon she'd have to do her job, following protocols that might tear these brothers apart. After what felt like forever, a doctor in blue scrubs approached them. The boy's grip tightened impossibly further on James's sleeve as they both stood up. "Your brother is stable," the doctor said, his voice gentle but tired. "He was severely dehydrated and malnourished, but we've got him on fluids and nutrition now. He's very weak, but he's responding well to treatment." The boy's shoulders sagged with relief, and James felt some of the tension leave his small frame. The puppy wagged its tail more vigorously, as if understanding the good news before James could ask any questions. Sarah stepped forward, her heels clicking on the hospital floor. "That's wonderful news," she said, then turned to face James and the boy. "Now we need to discuss temporary arrangements. We have an emergency foster home ready to take both boys while we sort out the situation." The words hung heavy in the air. The boy's breathing quickened and James felt him press closer to his side. The puppy stood up, sensing the change in atmosphere. "No," the boy whispered, his voice cracking. His fingers dug deeper into James's sleeve as he looked up with desperate eyes. "Please don't leave us." James looked down at those pleading eyes, then at Sarah, who waited expectantly with her clipboard. He saw the fear in the boy's face, the same fear he'd seen in that dark apartment, the same fear of being alone, of being abandoned again. The puppy whined softly, pressing against the boy's legs as if trying to hold him up. James felt the weight of the moment, the choice before him as clear as day, and in his heart he knew he'd already made it. James pulled Sarah aside in the hallway, his heart racing but his voice steady. "I want to foster them," he said, watching her eyes widen in surprise, both of them. Sarah adjusted her glasses, studying him carefully. "Officer James the First, understand you feel connected to these boys, but fostering isn't something to take lightly. There's extensive paperwork, home studies, background checks." "I know," James interrupted, his voice firm but gentle. "I know it's not simple, but these kids need stability, not another temporary solution. They've been failed by enough adults already." Sarah tapped her pen against her clipboard, her professional demeanor wavering slightly. "Do you truly understand what you're taking on? 2 traumatized children, one of them an infant. It's a huge responsibility." "I've never been more certain of anything," James replied, his eyes never leaving hers. "I can't explain it, but there's something about these boys I can't walk away." In the hospital room, the boy sat cross-legged on the bed, the puppy curled in his lap. His small finger stroked the dog's fur methodically, his eyes fixed on his baby brother in the nearby crib. The steady beep of monitors filled the quiet room. James returned with a paper bag full of food from the cafeteria. The smell of warm soup and fresh bread filled the room. He noticed how the boy's eyes followed his movements as he set out the food, watching him like a hawk. "Here you go, buddy," James said, handing him a bowl of soup and half a sandwich. The boy accepted them carefully, as if they might disappear. James pretended not to notice As the boy quickly tucked half the sandwich under his pillow, his movements quick and practiced. It was a gesture that spoke volumes, the instinct of someone who'd gone hungry too many times. James felt his throat tighten but kept his voice casual. There's plenty more. Where that came from, you can eat as much as you want. The boy glanced at him uncertainly, then at the hidden sandwich before slowly pulling it back out. The puppy wagged its tail encouragingly. As night fell, the hospital grew quieter. The baby slept peacefully in his crib, his color already better after hours of treatment. James settled into the chair beside the boy's bed, watching as the child fought to keep his eyes open. The puppy had made itself comfortable on the bed, pressed against the boy's side like a furry guardian. James leaned forward, his voice soft but firm. I'm going to make sure you're safe, he promised. Both of you. The boy studied James's face in the dim light, searching for something. Whatever he saw must have satisfied him, because he gave a small solemn nod. It wasn't much, but in that simple gesture James saw the first glimpse of trust. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across James's driveway as he pulled in. Carefully parking his car, through the rear view mirror he watched the boy, who hadn't spoken a word during the entire ride home. His small hands gripped Lucas's car seat tightly, knuckles white with tension. The puppy sat beside him, pressed close against his leg. Here we are, James said softly, trying to keep his voice light. He opened the back door, helping first with Lucas's car seat. The boy's grip loosened only slightly, his eyes scanning the unfamiliar surroundings with practiced weariness. James led them up the short path to his front door. The house wasn't anything special, just a modest single-story home with faded blue paint and white trim, but he'd spent the last few days preparing it, making sure everything was ready for their arrival. Let me show you around, James offered, unlocking the door. The boy followed silently, still carrying Lucas's car seat. Despite James's gentle offers to help, the puppy trotted alongside, its nail clicking against the hardwood floors. James started with the kitchen, where he'd stocked the fridge with fresh groceries. You can eat whenever you're hungry, he explained, opening cabinets to show their contents. No need to ask permission. The boy's eyes widened slightly at the sight of all the food, but his expression remained guarded. Next came the living room with its worn but comfortable couch, and finally the spare bedroom. James had worked hard to make it welcoming, fresh sheets on the bunk bed, a small nightlight plugged into the wall, even a few stuffed animals arranged on the top bunk. You can choose whichever bed you want, James said, gesturing to the bunk's top or bottom. It's up to you. The boy stood in the doorway, Lucas's car seat still in his arms. His eyes darted around the room, taking in every detail, every possible exit, but he made no move toward either bed. The puppy sat at his feet, looking up at him with concerned eyes. Later that night, after helping the boys settle Lucas into the crib James had set up, James went to check on them one last time before bed. The sight that greeted him made his heart clench. The boy hadn't chosen either bunk. Instead, he lay curled up on the floor beside Lucas's crib, the puppy snuggled against his chest. His body was tensed even in sleep, as if ready to spring up at any moment, moving quietly. James took an extra blanket from the bottom bunk with gentle movements. Careful not to wake him, he draped it over the boy and the puppy. The boy stirred slightly but didn't wake, his fingers unconsciously curling into the puppy's fur. James stood there for a moment, watching them sleep. The moonlight filtering through the window illuminated the boy's face, making him look even younger and more vulnerable. His heart ached at the thought of everything these children must have been through to make a bed feel unsafe. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen windows as James moved around the stove, flipping golden brown pancakes onto a plate. The sizzle of butter and the sweet aroma of maple syrup filled the air. He'd woken up early, wanting to make sure the boys had a proper breakfast. When he turned around, he found the older boy sitting ramrod straight at the kitchen table, his hands folded in his lap. The puppy sat faithfully beside his chair, its tail sweeping the floor in gentle swooshes. Dark circles lingered under the boy's eyes, evidence of a restless night. On the hard floor, James placed a stack of warm pancakes in front of him, along with butter syrup and a glass of milk. The boy's eyes followed every movement, but he didn't reach for anything. His shoulders remained tense, as if waiting for someone to snatch the food away. Go Ahead, James encouraged softly, "They're better while they're warm." The boy glanced at the food, then at James, then back at the food. Slowly, he picked up his fork, his movements careful and deliberate. James busied himself with making more pancakes, trying to ease the tension by not watching too closely as they ate a companionable silence. James decided it was time. He couldn't keep calling him the boy in his head. Setting his own fork down, he kept his voice gentle. "What's your name, kid?" The question hung in the air. The boy's fork paused halfway to his mouth, and his eyes dropped to his plate. The puppy nudged his leg with its nose as if offering support. Several long moments passed, filled only with the ticking of the kitchen clock. Finally, barely above a whisper, he spoke. "Noah." James nodded, letting the name settle in his mind. Noah, it suited him. "Somehow nice to meet you, Noah," he replied, keeping his tone casual, as if they were having an ordinary conversation on an ordinary morning. After breakfast, James needed to step outside to bring in the newspaper. Through the kitchen window, he could see Noah still sitting at the table. For the first time since arriving, something in the boy's posture had softened slightly. His rigid shoulders relaxed just a fraction as he slowly reached down, placing his hand on the puppy's head. The gesture was small, tentative, but it was there, a tiny crack in the walls Noah had built around himself. The puppy leaned into his touch, and for just a moment the ghost of a smile flickered across Noah's face. The kitchen was peaceful as James loaded the last dishes into the dishwasher. The gentle hum of the machine filled the otherwise quiet house. Through the doorway, he could see Noah perched on the edge of the living room couch, his body tense despite the soft cushions beneath him. The puppy lay curled against his leg, offering silent comfort. Baby Lucas's soft breathing came through the baby monitor, peaceful in his new crib upstairs. James had spent the morning assembling it, making sure every screw was tight and secure now and then. Noah's eyes darted to the front door, his shoulders hunching slightly at every passing car sound from outside. "Everything okay there, Noah?" James asked, keeping his voice gentle as he dried his hands on a dish towel. Noah gave a quick nod but didn't relax his fingers, absently stroked the puppy's for the repetitive motion, seeming to calm him somewhat. Later that evening, James pulled out a rocket-shaped nightlight from a shopping bag. He plugged it into the wall of the boy's room, casting a soft blue glow across the carpet. "See, not so dark now," he said, adjusting it slightly. "The top bunk's all made up for you." Noah stood in the doorway, the puppy at his heels. Without a word, he grabbed the blanket from the bed and settled onto the floor in the corner, as far from the door as possible. The puppy circled twice before lying down next to him. James ran a hand through his hair, his heart heavy. "You don't have to be scared here, kid." The words felt inadequate, but he needed to say them. Noah just pulled the blanket tighter around himself, his eyes fixed on some distant point. The house settled into nighttime silence. James tried to sleep, but found himself listening for any sound from the boys' room. Around midnight, a soft whimpering caught his attention. He padded down the hallway, careful to avoid the creaky floorboard near the bathroom. The nightlight's gentle glow revealed Noah sitting up against the wall, silent, tears tracking down his cheeks. His arms were wrapped around the puppy face, buried in its fur. The sight made James's chest ache. Without saying anything, he lowered himself to sit beside Noah. Carefully, he placed a hand on the boy's trembling back. Noah stiffened for a moment, but didn't pull away. Together they sat in the blue-tinted darkness, the only sounds being Noah's shaky breaths and the puppy's gentle snuffling. Time passed slowly. Eventually, Noah's breathing evened out, his body growing heavy with sleep. His head nodded forward, then sideways until it rested against James's arm. The puppy adjusted its position, stretching out across both their laps. James stayed perfectly still, listening to Noah's steady breathing, feeling the weight of trust beginning to form between them. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows as James flipped pancakes at the stove. The smell of breakfast filled the house, and for the first time Noah walked straight to the table and sat down without hovering uncertainly in the doorway. Hero trotted beside him, tail wagging as he settled under Noah's chair. Upstairs, Lucas's happy babbles echoed through the baby monitor. When James went to get him, the baby's face lit up with a bright smile. "Good morning, little guy," James said softly, lifting him from the crib. Lucas giggled, his tiny hands reaching for James's face. Hero darted between their legs as they made Their way downstairs, his paws clicking against the hardwood floors the puppy had taken to his new name instantly perking up whenever anyone called him at the mall. The crowds pressed in around them. Noah's fingers found James's sleeve, gripping it tightly as they navigated through the bustling shoppers. James kept a steady hand on the boy's shoulder, feeling him trembling slightly. "It's okay," James murmured. "I've got you." He steered them toward a quieter section of the department store where the children's items were displayed. Lucas sat contentedly in the shopping cart, occasionally reaching for passing objects with curious hands. Hero had to stay home, but Noah kept glancing around as if looking for him in the toiletries aisle. James stopped in front of the toothbrush display. "Go ahead," he said to Noah. "Pick whichever one you want." Noah stared at him, then at the colorful array of toothbrushes. His forehead wrinkled in confusion, as if the concept of choosing for himself was foreign. He stood frozen, eyes darting between the options and James's face. "Really?" James encouraged. "Anyone you like." Slowly Noah reached out and touched a blue toothbrush with silver stars on the handle. He quickly pulled his hand back, checking James's reaction. "That's a good choice," James said warmly. "Want to get it?" Noah nodded, carefully taking the toothbrush from the shelf. They moved on to the clothing section, where James held up different pajama sets. "Which ones do you like best?" Again, Noah seemed bewildered by the question. He'd probably never been asked his preference before. After several moments, he pointed to a set with rockets and stars that matched his new toothbrush. Back home that evening, James unpacked their purchases while Lucas played with some new toys on a blanket. Noah disappeared into the bathroom with his toothbrush, emerging a few minutes later empty-handed. When James checked later, he found Noah's blue toothbrush placed carefully in the holder next to his own. It was such a simple thing, but it spoke volumes. Noah was beginning to believe this could be home. The next day, James parked outside the therapist's office. Noah sat rigid in the passenger seat, his shoulders hunched and his face pale. Hero wasn't allowed inside, and Noah seemed especially vulnerable without his faithful companion. "Come on, buddy," James said, gently opening Noah's door. The boy didn't move, his fingers gripping the seat belt. The brick building loomed before them, its glass doors reflecting the morning light. Noah's breath quickened as they approached the entrance. At the door, he stopped completely, his feet planted firmly on the ground. "I don't need to talk," he muttered, staring at his worn sneakers. His voice was barely above a whisper. James knelt down on the concrete, bringing himself to Noah's eye level. The boy's face was a mask of tension, his jaw clenched tight. James could see the fear hiding behind his carefully controlled expression. "You don't have to say anything you don't want to," James assured him, his voice steady and calm. "But I'll be right here when you're done." Noah's eyes darted to James's face, searching for any sign of deception. Finding none, his shoulders dropped slightly. Inside the waiting room, James settled into an uncomfortable plastic chair as Noah disappeared behind the therapist's door. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the quiet space. James pulled out the manila folder he'd been avoiding. Noah's case file, each page revealed another layer of neglect. Incident reports, detailed calls from concerned neighbors about crying children. Hospital records showed sporadic emergency room visits for preventable illnesses. School records were practically non-existent. Noah had barely attended first grade before his parents stopped sending him. Altogether, James's stomach clenched as he read about the multiple eviction notices, the unpaid bills, the mounting evidence of 2 children left to fend for themselves. The file painted a clear picture. While other kids were learning to read and play, Noah had been learning to survive. When the session ended, Noah emerged looking exhausted. His eyes were red-rimmed and his usual careful composure had cracked slightly. He walked straight to James, standing close enough that their shoulders almost touched. The drive home started in silence. Noah pressed his forehead against the window, watching the buildings blur past his reflection in the glass. Showed a vulnerability James hadn't seen before. "You're not going to leave, right?" Noah's voice was so quiet James almost missed it. The question hung heavy in the air between them. James gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles turning white. "Never, kid." Noah nodded, once still looking out the window. In his face, James could see the battle between hope and experience. Wanting to believe, but scared to trust. The house was dark when James pulled into the driveway after his late shift. His keys jingled as he unlocked the front door, expecting to find Noah in his usual spot on the couch with Hero, maybe reading one of the library books they checked out, or watching TV. The babysitter had texted that Lucas was already asleep, but the living room was empty and silent. The TV screen was Black and Hero's favorite spot on the rug was vacant. James's heart rate picked up as he moved through the quiet house. "Noah," he called out, trying to keep his voice steady despite the growing knot in his stomach. No answer. He took the stairs 2 at a time, his footsteps echoing in the stillness. The door to the boys' room was open. Lucas slept peacefully in his crib, but Noah's bed was empty. Here wasn't in his usual spot by the bed either. James's hands grew cold with panic. He checked the bathroom, the closets, every corner where a small boy might hide. Nothing. His mind raced with horrible possibilities as he rushed back downstairs. That's when he caught a glimpse through the kitchen window, a small figure sitting on the back steps. James hurried outside, relief washing over him as he saw Noah sitting there in the dark. Hero curled up faithfully beside him, the boy's face was turned upward, studying the night sky with an intensity that made James's heart ache. "I thought maybe they'd come back," Noah said quietly, not turning around. His voice sounded smaller than usual, more fragile. James carefully lowered himself onto the step beside Noah. The concrete was cold beneath him. "Your parents?" Noah nodded, his arms tightening around his knees. "They won't." His voice cracked on the words, and he swallowed hard. "I know that," but he paused, struggling to find the words. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do now." The vulnerability in Noah's voice made James's chest tighten. Without hesitation, he wrapped his arm around the boy's thin shoulders and pulled him into a firm hug. "You don't have to figure it out alone," James said softly. "You've got me." For a moment, Noah stayed stiff in his arms, then slowly he relaxed, nodding against James's shoulder. It was the first time he'd allowed himself to be held, to be comforted. Hero pressed closer to them, both offering his own kind of support in the quiet night. The next day, the morning sun cast long shadows across the school's front walkway. As James parked the car, Noah sat frozen in the passenger seat, his knuckles white against his backpack straps. Through the windshield they watched other kids streaming into the building, their laughter and chatter drifting through the closed windows. "Ready?" James asked gently. Noah gave a tiny nod, but his body language said otherwise. His shoulders were hunched, making him look even smaller than usual. They walked together toward the entrance, Noah's steps getting slower with each foot closer to the door. Around them, kids rushed past, bumping into each other, calling out greetings. Noah flinched at every loud noise, pressing closer to James's side. The hallway inside was a chaos of primary colors and children's artwork. Noah's new teacher, Mrs. Chen, waited by her classroom door with a warm smile. She'd visited their house last week to help Noah feel more comfortable, but he still tensed when she approached. "Good morning, Noah," she said softly. "We're so happy to have you join us." Noah managed a slight nod, his eyes fixed on the floor tiles inside the classroom. Mrs. Chen introduced Noah to his new classmates. 20 pairs of curious eyes turned toward him. Noah stood at the front, rigid and silent, his face carefully blank as Mrs. Chen explained he was a new student. When she asked if he wanted to say anything about himself, he shook his head. The morning passed in a blur of worksheets and quiet instructions. At lunch, Noah found an empty table in the corner of the cafeteria. He pulled out the lunch James had packed, a sandwich, apple slices, and cookies, but didn't touch any of it. Around him, the cafeteria buzzed with activity and conversation. A group of kids at the next table whispered, glancing his way. Noah could feel their stares, but kept his eyes down, making himself as small as possible. "Hey," said a voice beside him. A boy with glasses and a Star Wars t-shirt stood there, lunch tray in hand. "Want to sit with us?" Noah's shoulders tensed. He shook his head, quickly shrinking further into himself until the boy walked away looking disappointed. The afternoon dragged on endlessly. When the final bell rang, Noah was the first one out the door. He spotted James's car immediately and hurried toward it, relief visible in every step. James didn't ask questions. When Noah climbed in, just handed him a granola bar and a juice box. Hero's tail thumped happily from the back seat as Noah took the snack with trembling fingers. He ate slowly, methodically, staring out the window while clutching Hero's leash like a lifeline. The autumn breeze rustled through the trees as Noah walked along the sidewalk, Hero padding faithfully beside him. After a week of school, he'd settled into a quiet routine, keeping to himself, doing his work and counting the minutes until he could leave. The other kids had mostly stopped trying to talk to him, which was exactly how he wanted it. Hero's leash was warm in his hand, a constant reminder that he wasn't alone. The dog's presence made the walk home bearable, even peaceful, but that peace shattered when he heard snickering behind him. "Hey, look, it's the new kid," a voice called out, "the one living with the Cop Noah's shoulders tensed, but he kept walking, picking up his pace slightly. Hero sensed his anxiety moving closer to his side. Is that supposed to be a dog? Another voice jeered. Looks more like a street rat. 3 older boys appeared in front of him, blocking his path. They wore matching smirks, their backpacks slung carelessly over their shoulders. Noah recognized them from the hallways at school. 8th graders who seemed to own the place. Figures the orphan kid has a mutt. The tallest one sneered. What's wrong? Couldn't afford a real dog. Noah's throat felt tight, but he stayed silent, gripping Hero's leash tighter. The dog growled softly, sensing the tension. Maybe it followed him home, 'cause they're both strays. Another boy laughed. The tall one stepped forward, his foot shooting out toward Hero. The kick caught the dog's side, making him yelp in pain. Something inside Noah snapped with a surge of fury. He didn't know he possessed. Noah launched himself at the boy, shoving him hard. The bigger kid stumbled backward, falling onto the sidewalk. His friends jumped back, startled by Noah's sudden action. Hey! A sharp voice cut through the air. A teacher from the school was running toward them, her face stern. At the same moment, James's police car pulled up to the curb. The older boy scattered quickly, leaving Noah standing there, his hands still clenched into fists, breathing hard. The teacher reached him first, gripping his shoulder firmly. Fighting is absolutely unacceptable, she scolded, her voice sharp with disappointment. James approached, quickly taking in the scene with concerned eyes. The teacher explained what she'd seen, while Noah stared at the ground, his body rigid with tension. Hero pressed against his leg, whimpering softly. Back home, James led Noah into the living room. He knelt down in front of the boy, his expression serious but gentle. I'm not mad, James said quietly, but you can't solve things like that. Noah's fist clenched at his sides. He hurt Hero, he said, his voice thick with emotion. James sighed, running a hand through his hair. I get it, but protecting someone doesn't always mean fighting. Noah turned away, his jaw tight. He didn't know how else to handle it. Fighting was all he'd ever known. It was how he'd protected Lucas for so long. The idea that there might be another way seemed impossible to grasp. The playground buzzed with activity during recess, filled with laughing children playing tag and soccer. James stood at the school fence, watching Noah through a gap between the chain links. His heart ached as he observed the boy hovering at the edges of various groups, his shoulders hunched, never quite joining in. That evening, after dinner, James disappeared into the garage and returned with something hidden behind his back. Noah sat on the couch, absently stroking Hero's fur while staring at the TV. Hey, kid, James called out. Got something for you. Noah looked up, his expression guarded as always. James revealed a brand new soccer ball, its black and white panels still pristine and shiny. Come on, James said, heading toward the backyard. Let's see what you got. Noah followed hesitantly, Hero trotting beside him. The evening air was cool and crisp, perfect for playing outside. James placed the ball on the grass and gave it a gentle kick toward Noah. The boy stared at it for a moment before tapping it back, barely putting any force behind the motion. His movements were stiff, uncertain, like he wasn't sure if he was allowed to really play. Hero changed everything. The dog darted after the ball, barking playfully, his tail wagging with excitement. He nudged it with his nose, making it roll in unpredictable directions. James saw his opportunity. He made an exaggerated lunge for the ball, completely missing it and stumbling dramatically. Oh no, he called out, flailing his arms. I'm the worst soccer player ever. A tiny smirk appeared on Noah's face then as Hero chased the ball back toward him. Noah's foot connected more firmly. The ball soared past James, who dove in slow motion, groaning in pretend defeat. That's when it happened. A sound James had never heard before filled the backyard. Noah's laugh, not a polite chuckle or a forced smile, but a real, genuine laugh that seemed to bubble up from somewhere deep inside him. It was unguarded and pure, the sound of a child simply enjoying himself. They played until the sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink. James made increasingly ridiculous attempts to steal the ball, while Noah's confidence grew with each kick. Hero darted between them, barking and jumping, adding to the chaos and fun. When darkness finally forced them inside, Noah's cheeks were flushed from running and his eyes held a spark that James hadn't seen before. After showers and bedtime routines, James walked past the boys' room for one final check. The sound of Hero's soft snores drew his attention. There, on the bottom bunk, lay Noah, not on the floor where he usually slept, but actually in his bed. Hero was curled up next to him, both of them peaceful in sleep. It was a small victory, but to James it felt enormous. Back at home, James was sorting through paperwork at the kitchen table when his phone buzzed. An unknown number flashed Across the screen, he almost let it go to voicemail, but something made him answer. "Hello," he said, shuffling papers aside the silence on the other end. Stretched for several heartbeats, then a woman's voice, hesitant and thin, came through. Is Noah okay?" James's hand froze on the papers, his stomach clenched as he recognized the voice from old voicemails he reviewed during the investigation. Noah's mother. He glanced toward the living room, where Noah was helping Lucas stack blocks, Hero watching attentively beside them. Without a word, James stepped onto the back porch, quietly closing the door behind him. "Why are you calling?" he asked, keeping his voice low but firm. "We've been trying to get better," she stammered, her words tumbled out faster, now desperate and rambling. "We didn't mean to leave them so long. Things got so hard we couldn't think straight, but we're different now. We've been working, saving money." James's jaw tightened. He thought of Noah sleeping on the floor those first weeks, of Lucas's tiny body hooked up to hospital machines, of the empty cabinets and soiled crib he'd found in that apartment. "You abandoned them," he cut in, his voice cold as ice. "You left an 8-year-old to care for a baby with no food, no water, nothing. Noah doesn't need false hope from you now, please," she begged. "I'm their mother. I just want to see them just once." James ended the call. His hand shook as he gripped the phone, anger and protective instinct surging through him. He took several deep breaths of the cool evening air before going back inside. That night, Noah pushed his food around his plate, barely eating. He hadn't said more than a few words since dinner started, and even Hero's gentle nudges couldn't draw him out of his unusual quietness. It was as if he could sense something was wrong, though James knew he couldn't have heard the call. James watched as Noah absently stroked Hero's fur, the dog's head resting on his lap under the table. The boy's eyes were distant, lost in thoughts. James couldn't reach. Hero whined, softly pressing closer to Noah's side as if trying to anchor him to the present moment. The question hung in James's mind all evening like a heavy cloud. Should he tell Noah about the call? The boy seemed more withdrawn than usual, pushing his green beans around his plate and barely touching his chicken. Even Hero's usually successful attempts to sneak table scraps hadn't drawn more than a week's smile. As they cleaned up after dinner, Noah mechanically dried the dishes James handed him. The only sounds were the clinking of plates and the soft padding of Hero's paws as he moved between them, ever watchful of his two favorite people. Suddenly, Noah's small voice broke the silence. "Do you think they're ever coming back?" The plate in James's hands nearly slipped. He set it down carefully, his heart aching at the mixture of hope and fear in Noah's voice. This was the first time the boy had mentioned his parents since that night on the back steps. James dried his hands and guided Noah to the kitchen table. They sat down together, Hero immediately settling at Noah's feet. The overhead light cast soft shadows across Noah's face, making him look even younger than his 8 years. Taking a deep breath, James turned to face him fully. He thought about sugarcoating it, about offering some comforting lie, but Noah had faced too many harsh truths in his young life to deserve anything less than honesty. "I don't know," James said gently, "but I do know this family isn't about who leaves, it's about who stays." No fingers found their way into Hero's fur, gripping tightly. The dog stayed perfectly still, as if understanding the importance of this moment. The clock ticked softly in the background as Noah processed James's words, finally in a whisper so quiet James almost missed it. "Noah said you stayed." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. James felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Always," he replied firmly. Noah swallowed hard and nodded back. James watched as something shifted in the boy's expression. For the first time since he'd known him, Noah didn't look like he was waiting for someone else to return. The autumn breeze rustled through the park's trees, scattering golden leaves across the weathered path. Noah walked beside James, one hand holding Hero's leash while the other swung freely at his side. The boy seemed lighter these days, more present in the moment rather than lost in worried thoughts. His shoulders weren't as tense as they used to be, and sometimes he even hummed quietly to himself as they walked. Then, without warning, Noah stopped dead in his tracks. His whole body went rigid, and Hero's leash slipped from his suddenly slack fingers. The color drained from his face as James followed Noah's frozen gaze across the path and felt his own heart skip a beat. The peaceful afternoon shattered like glass. There she stood, Noah's mother. Her clothes were wrinkled, her hair unkempt, and her eyes were fixed on Noah with an intensity that made James's protective instincts flare. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her hands fidgeted restlessly at her sides. Without Hesitation, he stepped in front of Noah, feeling the boy's small hand grabbed the back of his jacket, fingers twisting into the fabric she approached them with unsteady steps, her eyes glassy, and unfocused words tumbled from her mouth. In a rush stream, Noah, I'm so sorry, I was going to come back. Her voice cracked with desperation as she took another step forward, leaves crunching beneath her worn sneakers. Noah's grip on James's jacket tightened until his knuckles turned white, but he remained silent. Hero, sensing the tension, moved closer to Noah's side and let out a low warning growl when Noah's mother reached toward him. The dog's protective stance made it clear he wouldn't let anyone hurt his boy. James stood as ground, his voice firm and controlled despite the anger burning in his chest. You don't get to just show up. He could feel Noah trembling slightly behind him, could sense the storm of emotions radiating from the child he'd grown to love as his own. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words and broken promises. Then Noah stepped out from behind James. Though he kept hold of his hand, his voice was quiet but remarkably steady as he looked at his mother, his chin lifted slightly in a show of courage that made James's heart ache with pride. You left us. Those 3 words carried the weight of countless hungry nights of changing Lucas diapers with no help, of wondering if they would survive another day. The memories of empty cupboards and cold rooms hung in the air between them. His mother opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. She closed it again, her shoulders sagging, the fight seeming to drain out of her entirely. After a moment that felt like an eternity, Noah simply turned away. James placed a protective hand on the boy's shoulder as they walked away, Hero padding faithfully beside them. The autumn breeze picked up again, sending more leaves dancing around their feet. Noah didn't look back, his steps growing stronger with each foot of distance between him and his past. The house was quiet that evening, filled with the kind of silence that comes after big moments. Noah sat on the living room floor, absently running his fingers through Hero's fur while staring at nothing in particular. James moved around the house doing small tasks, giving Noah the space he needed to process. The boy hadn't said a word since they'd left the park, but James could see the thoughts churning behind his eyes. The sun slowly sank below the horizon, painting the walls in soft orange light. James warmed up Lucas's bottle and headed upstairs for the baby's bedtime routine. The familiar sounds of running water and gentle splashing drifted down from the bathroom as James gave Lucas's bath. Noah remained downstairs, but his eyes kept drifting toward the stairs. Hero nudged his hand encouragingly, as if sensing his inner struggle. Finally Noah stood up, his sock-covered feet silent on the carpet. As he made his way upstairs, he reached Lucas's room just as James was settling the baby into his crib. The nightlight cast a warm glow across the room, making shadows dance on the walls. Noah lingered in the doorway, his fingers fidgeting with the hem of his t-shirt. James hummed softly, tucking the blanket around Lucas, who was already drifting off to sleep, his tiny fist relaxed against the sheet. She wasn't really coming back, was she? Noah's voice was barely above a whisper, but in the quiet room it felt loud enough to break something fragile. James straightened up from the crib and turned to look at Noah. The boy's face was a mixture of hurt and understanding, like he already knew the answer but needed to hear it anyway. James moved to sit on the small bench near the window, patting the space beside him. Noah hesitated for just a moment before joining him. Hero padded over and settled at their feet, his chin resting on Noah's shoes. The street lamp outside cast long shadows through the window, and somewhere in the distance a car horn honked. I don't think so, James said gently, his words honest but careful. He watched as Noah processed this, the boy shoulders rising and falling with a deep breath. Noah nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on his hands in his lap. Then he looked up at James, something new flickering in his expression. But you're still here? James felt warmth spread through his chest at those words. He smiled, the kind of smile that comes straight from the heart. Yeah, I am. The room fell quiet again, but it wasn't the heavy silence from before. Noah studied James's face for a long moment, as if searching for something. Then, in a movement that felt both hesitant and determined, he leaned into James's side, resting his head against him. James wrapped an arm around the boy's small shoulders, feeling Noah relax under the touch. In the crib, Lucas made a soft sleeping sound, and Hero's tail thumped gently against the floor. For the first time since arriving at James's house, Noah let himself believe this was home. The autumn breeze rustled through the trees outside as James watched Noah through the kitchen window. The boy was in the backyard with Hero tossing a tennis ball and laughing as the dog bounded after it. It was a sound that had become more frequent lately, that genuine carefree laugh that made James's heart swell inside. Lucas babbled happily in his high chair, messily eating chunks of banana. The house had transformed over the past weeks, filled with toys, children's books, and the constant patter of small feet. Noah's artwork now decorated the fridge, and his backpack had found a permanent home by the door. James noticed the changes in Noah, too. The boy no longer jumped at sudden movements or stuffed food in his pockets. For later at dinner, he asked for seconds without hesitation. His teacher had called just yesterday to say Noah had made friends with a boy named Tommy, even inviting him over to play after school. The envelope sat heavy in James's pocket as he cleaned up Lucas's mess. He'd been carrying it around for days, waiting for the right moment. His hand brushed against it now, and he took a deep breath. The papers inside represented everything he wanted. Everything he hoped Noah wanted too. Noah, James called through the open window. "Can you come inside for a minute?" The boy jogged in, cheeks flushed from playing hero, trotting faithfully at his heels. Noah's hair was slightly messy, and his sneakers were muddy, but his eyes were bright and alert. He didn't hesitate to sit at the kitchen table when James gestured, a far cry from the way child who had first entered this house. James settled across from him, pulling out the envelope. His heart hammered in his chest as he placed it on the table between them. "I've been thinking about something important," he began, watching Noah's curious expression. "What if we make this official?" Noah's eyebrows furrowed as James slid the envelope closer with careful fingers. The boy pulled out the papers inside. His eyes widened as he read the words at the top: "Petition for adoption." "You don't have to say yes," James said softly, noticing how Noah's hands trembled slightly. "But I want to be your dad." "Noah, yours and Lucas's for real?" Noah stared at the papers, his mouth opening and closing without sound. When he finally looked up at James, tears were pooling in his eyes. "You really want me?" His voice cracked on the last word. Small and vulnerable, James felt his own eyes growing wet as he smiled more than anything. Noah's lower lip quivered as he looked back at the papers. A tear splashed onto the document, creating a small dark circle. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, sniffling. Then slowly, deliberately, he nodded. "Okay." James was around the table in an instant, pulling Noah into a tight hug. The boy's arms wrapped around him immediately, fingers gripping the back of James's shirt. Hero barked excitedly beside them, tail wagging furiously as he sensed the joy in the room. The morning sun filtered through the bedroom window as James helped Noah with the buttons on his light blue dress shirt. The boy's fingers trembled, struggling with each button. James noticed the slight shake in Noah's hands and gently took over, carefully fastening each one. "What if they say no?" Noah's voice was barely above a whisper, his eyes fixed on the floor. The fear in his voice made James's heart ache. James knelt down, placing his hands on Noah's shoulders until their eyes met. "They won't, but even if they did, I'd still be your dad." His voice was firm, steady, leaving no room for doubt. Nothing changes. That the courthouse loomed before them, its stone steps seeming to stretch endlessly upward. Noah held Lucas close to his chest, the baby contentedly playing with Noah's collar. Hero patted alongside them, his leash wrapped securely around Noah's wrist. The dog's presence seemed to calm Noah's nerves, just as it had since that first night inside the courtroom. The polished wooden benches gleamed under fluorescent lights. Noah sat straight back beside James, one hand still holding Lucas, the other buried in Hero's fur. The judge, a kind-faced woman with silver-rimmed glasses, looked down from her bench. "Noah," she said gently, "I need to ask you something very important. Do you want Officer James Peterson to be your legal father?" Noah's breath caught for a moment. The courtroom fell silent, waiting. Hero pressed closer to his side, and Noah's fingers tightened in the dog's fur. Then, with a clarity that filled the entire room, he spoke. "Yes." His voice rang out strong and sure, no trace of his earlier nervousness. The scratch of pen on paper echoed through the room as the judge signed the documents. It seemed too simple, really, just a few signatures to make official what their hearts had known for months. Walking down the courthouse steps afterward, James reached over and playfully ruffled Noah's carefully combed hair. The formality of the morning melted away as Noah ducked a small laugh, escaping. "How does it feel?" James asked, watching his son's face carefully. Noah looked up at him, sunlight catching in his eyes. His smile was small but real, the kind that reached all the way to his eyes. "Feels like I finally Belongs somewhere. The autumn air turned crisp as November settled in, bringing with it the warm sense of cinnamon and baking pies from James's kitchen. He stood at the counter, methodically peeling potatoes while checking a recipe on his phone. This would be their first real family holiday, and he wanted everything to be perfect. Noah lingered in the doorway, watching with curious eyes as James pulled out a turkey from the refrigerator. Hero sat beside him, tail wag hopefully at the smell of food. The kitchen counter was covered with ingredients: fresh vegetables, herbs, and several cans of cranberry sauce. We never had Thanksgiving before, Noah admitted quietly, his fingers absently stroking Hero's head. His voice carried a hint of uncertainty, as if he wasn't sure what to expect. James smiled warmly. Well, then we'll make this one extra special. He gestured to the mountain of food. Want to help me peel some potatoes? Later that afternoon, the house filled with the sounds of friendly chatter as James's closest friends arrived. Officer Sarah from the precinct brought homemade rolls, and James's partner Mike came with his wife and 2 kids. The dining room table, usually too big for just the 3 of them, now felt perfectly sized. Steam rose from the perfectly cooked turkey as everyone settled into their seats. Lucas sat in his high chair, happily mushing sweet potatoes between his fingers. Hero lay under the table between Noah and James, his tail thumping contentedly against the floor. Before we eat, James announced, I thought we could go around and share what we're thankful for this year. He smiled at his guests as they shared their answers: family, health, friendship. When it came to Noah's turn, he shifted in his chair, clearly uncomfortable with all eyes on him. His fingers played with the edge of his napkin as he stared down at his plate. The silence stretched for a moment before he mumbled, I guess I'm thankful for Hero. James raised an eyebrow, a knowing smirk playing at his lips. Just Hero? Noah's cheeks flushed slightly. He glanced up at James, then back down at his plate. After a moment's hesitation, he added in a soft voice, and you? The evening wound down with warm conversation and second helpings of pumpkin pie. As the guests began to leave, Noah carried his plate to the kitchen without being prompted. He reached up and carefully placed it in the sink, something he'd never done before. James watched from the doorway, a smile spreading across his face. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes about how far they'd come. The crisp white envelope sat innocently on the kitchen counter, but James's stomach churned as he read the return address. Her handwriting hadn't changed, the same looping letters that had abandoned her sons with nothing but a hastily scribbled note. He picked up the letter, its weight feeling far heavier than paper should. For nearly an hour, he debated what to do. Part of him wanted to protect Noah from any more pain, to simply make the letter disappear, but he knew that wouldn't be right. Noah deserved to make his own choices now. That evening, after Lucas was asleep, James found Noah reading on the couch with Hero curled up beside him. He sat down carefully, the envelope in his hands. Noah, he said gently, there's something I need to give you. It's from your mother. Noah's book lowered slowly, his eyes fixed on the envelope. The color drained from his face, but his expression remained carefully blank. A habit James knew came from years of protecting himself from disappointment. You don't have to read it if you don't want to, James assured him. It's your choice. Noah took the envelope with slightly trembling fingers. Hero sensed his tension and pressed closer against his side for what felt like forever. Noah just stared at it, turning it over and over in his hands. Finally, with deliberate movements, he tore it open. The pages inside were covered in dense writing. As Noah read, James watched his face, carefully ready to step in if needed, but Noah's expression remained oddly calm, almost distant as his eyes moved across the words. When he finished, he carefully folded the pages and set them on the coffee table. The silence stretched between them until Noah spoke, his voice quiet but steady. She wants to see me, he said. Says she's sorry that she's different now. He shook his head slowly. She doesn't mean it. James watched him carefully. How do you know? Because Noah said, his hand finding Hero's fur. She says the same thing she used to say to Lucas when he cried that everything would be better tomorrow, that she'd fix things. He swallowed hard, but she never did. James felt a surge of pride mixed with sadness. Noah had grown so much, learned to trust his own judgment, but it hurt to see him have to be so wise about such painful things. You don't have to decide anything now, James said softly, squeezing Noah's shoulder. Take your time thinking about it. Noah nodded, but James could see in his eyes that he'd already made his decision. Later that night, as James passed the kitchen, he saw Noah drop the Led her into the trash without hesitation. He didn't look back at it, just walked away with Hero at his heels, heading toward the bedroom where his baby brother slept peacefully and his dad would always be there in the morning. The autumn leaves scattered across their front yard marked a full year since that fateful night when a scruffy puppy had led James to two abandoned boys. Now watching Noah helped Lucas take